A 3-year-old girl walked into a dying man's bedroom holding a plastic cup of water in both hands. And by the end of this story, that same little girl would change the fate of a billion-dollar empire forever. Nobody, not his doctors, not his lawyers, not even his own family, could get through to him. But she did. And what she discovered about him would break your heart before it healed it. Hey there, welcome back to the channel. Before we start, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from today and which country do you call home? I love seeing where this community lives. Today's story is one of the most emotional ones we've ever told. A story about loneliness, about guilt buried for years, and about how sometimes the smallest hands are the only ones strong enough to hold a broken man together. I promise you, stay until the end because the ending of this one is going to stay with you for a long, long time. Nobody wanted the night shift in Ethan Whitfield's penthouse. Not the nurses. Not the housekeepers. Not even the men who had worked for his family for 20 years. Ethan was 30 years old, and he owned more buildings in Manhattan than most cities had streets. His name was on skyscrapers in 6 countries. Forbes had called him the coldest man in real estate, and for once they weren't exaggerating. He didn't smile in photographs. He didn't attend his own birthday parties. He fired people over email. And 3 months ago, he had collapsed in the middle of a board meeting, and the doctors told him the truth in a small white room with no windows. His body was failing. A rare blood disorder, the kind that didn't care how much money you had, was slowly shutting him down. Without round-the-clock care, a feeding line, and complete rest, he wouldn't see the next spring. He had the best doctors in the country. He had nurses on retainer who made more in a month than most people made in a year. And still, one by one, they quit. He doesn't want help, one nurse told the staffing agency. He wants to be left alone to die in peace, and he makes that very clear. The housekeeping agency had sent 7 different women in 2 months. All 7 had walked out within the week. Ethan didn't yell. He didn't throw things. He simply looked at people with eyes so empty, so tired of the world, that grown adults found themselves unable to stay in the room with him. Which is how, on a rainy Tuesday in October, Elena Cruz found herself standing in the marble lobby of the Whitfield Tower penthouse, holding her daughter's hand, praying this job wouldn't disappear like the last 3 had. Elena was 32. 3 years ago, she had been a schoolteacher in Ohio with a husband, a mortgage, and a baby on the way. Now she was a single mother in New York City, cleaning apartments for rich strangers because the agency that had placed her didn't have anyone else to send, and because she had a daughter to feed and nowhere else to turn. You can't bring a child to a client's home, the agency manager had warned her on the phone that morning. It's against policy. My babysitter cancelled, Elena had said, voice shaking. Please. I'll lose the job either way if I don't show up. The manager had sighed and told her to keep the little girl quiet, out of sight, in the staff room down the hall. Elena had agreed to anything. She needed this job. The pay was triple what she made anywhere else, and it came with something even more precious. A small apartment on the building's lower floor, meant for live-in staff. A roof that wasn't a shelter. A door that locked from the inside. For a woman who had been sleeping on her sister's pull-out couch for 8 months, that mattered more than any salary. Her daughter Mia was 3 years old, with a mess of dark curls and eyes that noticed everything. She held her mother's hand tightly as the elevator climbed 60 floors, ears popping, and stared up at the gold-trimmed ceiling like she'd stepped into a fairy tale. Is a king going to live here, Mommy? Mia whispered. Elena forced a smile. Something like that, baby. She had no idea how right her daughter would turn out to be, and how wrong too, because the man behind that door wasn't a king. He was a man who had built himself a golden cage, and was waiting inside it to die alone. When the elevator doors opened, a stone-faced butler named Gerald greeted them without warmth. Mr. Whitfield does not like noise, he said, glancing down at Mia with visible disapproval. Or visitors. Keep the child in the staff quarters at all times. He is not to be disturbed. Are we understood? Elena nodded quickly, tightening her grip on Mia's small hand. Yes, sir. Absolutely. But children, as every parent learns eventually, do not always listen to warnings, especially when their small hearts sense something adults have long stopped noticing. And that night, while Elena scrubbed floors 3 rooms away, Mia slipped out of the staff quarters in her socked feet, following the sound of a machine beeping softly down a long marble hallway, toward a room she had been told never to enter. She pushed open the door just wide enough to see him. A man, pale and still, lay in a bed the size of her entire bedroom back home. Tubes ran from his arm to a machine beside him. The city lights glittered behind him through a wall of glass, but his face looked like winter, cold, closed, and completely alone. Mia didn't know he was a billionaire. She didn't know his name was on buildings across the world, or that men in suits flew across oceans just to shake his hand. All she saw was a person lying by himself in the dark, with nobody sitting beside him. So she did the only thing a 3-year-old knows how to do. She walked in, climbed onto the small bench at the foot of his bed, and sat down. And that is the moment that would change everything. For him, for her mother, and for a truth that had been buried for 8 long years, waiting for a child's hand to finally dig it back up. Some silences hurt more than screaming ever could. Ethan Whitfield had been staring at the same spot on the ceiling for 3 hours when he felt it, a small weight settling gently at the foot of his bed. He turned his head, expecting a nurse, expecting Gerald, expecting anyone he could send away with a single cold word. Instead, he found a little girl in a faded yellow t-shirt, staring at him with enormous brown eyes, completely unafraid. "Hi," she said simply. Ethan blinked. For a moment, he genuinely wondered if the medication was making him hallucinate. "Who are you?" "Mia," she said, as if that explained everything. "My mommy is cleaning your kitchen. It's really big. Bigger than our whole apartment." He should have called security. He should have pressed the intercom and had Gerald escort this child, and probably her mother, whoever she was, straight out of the building before the lawyers even knew there'd been a breach of the household agreement. That was the old Ethan. The Ethan from 6 months ago, before his body had started failing him, would have done exactly that without a second thought. But something in him, something buried under years of boardrooms and betrayals and a childhood he refused to think about, kept him quiet. He simply watched her. "You're supposed to be somewhere else," he finally said, his voice rough from disuse. "I know," Mia admitted, entirely unbothered. "But you looked sad. Are you sick?" The bluntness of it startled him. Nobody had asked him that in months, not really. His board members asked about his prognosis in terms of stock stability. His doctors asked about symptoms in terms of clinical charts. Nobody had simply asked, "Are you sick?" the way you'd ask a friend on the playground who'd scraped their knee. "Yes," he said quietly. "I'm sick. My mommy gets sick sometimes too. I bring her water and sit with her until she feels better." Mia announced this like it was the most obvious solution in the world, then hopped down off the bench, toddled over to the small side table, and, with great effort in both hands, picked up the glass of water sitting there, untouched since morning, and held it out to him. "Here," she said. "This helps." Ethan stared at the glass. His hands trembled slightly as he took it from her, careful not to spill the little that remained after her uneven grip. He hadn't been handed anything by another human being in weeks that wasn't a syringe, a pill, or a legal document requiring a signature. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt strange in his mouth, like a language he'd forgotten how to speak. Down the hall, Elena was scrubbing a spotless countertop for the 3rd time, glancing anxiously at the clock, wondering where her daughter had wandered off to. When she finally found the staff room empty, her heart dropped into her stomach. She moved through the enormous apartment as quietly and quickly as she could, terror mounting with every silent hallway, until she reached the master bedroom door, slightly ajar, and heard something that made her freeze completely. Laughter. Not loud. Barely more than a breath. But it was there. A rusty, unfamiliar sound coming from a man the entire household staff described as a ghost who forgot how to speak. Elena pushed the door open just enough to see her daughter sitting cross-legged on the billionaire's bed, telling him, in complete, unbothered seriousness, about her stuffed rabbit named Butterscotch who was afraid of thunderstorms. "Mia!" Elena gasped, rushing forward. "I am so sorry, sir. I told her to stay in the—" "It's fine," Ethan said, cutting her off. His voice wasn't cold. It wasn't warm either. More like a door creaking open after years of rust. "She's fine." Elena froze mid-step, stunned. In 2 months, not one nurse, not one housekeeper, had heard him say a full sentence that wasn't a complaint or a dismissal. "I'll take her, sir. It won't happen again. I said it's fine." He looked at Mia, who was now attempting to fix the tangled blanket at his feet with the seriousness of a surgeon. "What's your name?" "Elena," she said quietly. "Elena Cruz." Something flickered behind his eyes at the name, the faintest shadow of recognition, gone as quickly as it appeared. He said nothing more about it that night. But he would remember it. And 3 days later, that name would send him searching through boxes he hadn't opened in 8 years, looking for a photograph he prayed he was wrong about. For now, though, all he said was, "She can stay. Just for a little while." It was the first thing Ethan Whitfield had asked for, instead of ordered, in longer than he could remember. The truth doesn't knock politely. Kicks the door down. Over the next 2 weeks, something changed inside the penthouse that no doctor, no medicine, and no amount of money had been able to change. Every evening, once her chores were finished, Elena would find Mia curled up at the foot of Ethan's bed, chattering about her day, her stuffed rabbit, the pigeons on the balcony she'd named one by one. And every evening Ethan, a man who once ended phone calls with world leaders in under 90 seconds, let her stay for hours. He started eating more. His nurse noted it in her chart with visible surprise. His blood pressure stabilized. He asked Gerald, for the first time in months, to open the curtains in the morning instead of leaving them shut. "She's good for him," the nurse told Elena quietly one evening. "I don't know what it is, but she's good for him." Elena didn't know what to make of any of it either. She only knew that her daughter had taken to this dying stranger with a devotion that unsettled and moved her in equal measure. And she knew that every time Ethan looked at her, not at Mia but at her Elena, there was something searching in his expression, like he was trying to place a memory just out of reach. It happened on a Thursday night. Mia had fallen asleep on the bench at the foot of his bed, exhausted from an afternoon of helping arrange his medicine bottles by color. Elena had come to carry her back to their apartment when Ethan spoke. His voice low. "Cruz," he said. "That's not a common name. Where is your husband, Elena?" Elena's hand stilled on her daughter's small shoulders. "He passed away," she said quietly. "Almost 4 years ago now. Before Mia was born." "How?" She hesitated. It wasn't a question people usually asked so directly, and something about his tone, urgent, almost frightened, made her uneasy. "There was a car accident," she said finally. "On the interstate outside Columbus. He wasn't even supposed to be on that road that night. He was driving a man home from a business dinner. The man's driver had gotten sick, and Marcus offered because that's who he was. Always the one who offered." Ethan had gone very still. "There was black ice," Elena continued, her voice tightening the way it always did when she told this story, which wasn't often. "The car spun off the road into a ravine. Marcus got the other man out. Pulled him through the window himself, half conscious. Dragged him 20 feet from the wreck before it caught fire. He saved that man's life." Her voice cracked just slightly. "He didn't make it out himself. The room had gone deathly silent except for the soft, steady beep of the machine beside the bed. "What was the other man's name?" Ethan asked, and his voice had dropped to something barely above a whisper. Elena frowned slightly, confused by the intensity in his face. "Robert," she said. "Robert Whitfield." The glass of water on the nightstand, the same glass Mia had brought him weeks earlier, slipped from Ethan's hand and shattered against the floor. Because Robert Whitfield was his father. And Ethan remembered that night with a clarity that had haunted him for 8 years. The phone call at 2 a.m. His father's shaking voice on the line saying, "A man died getting me out of that car. Ethan, a man I don't even know died so I could come home to you." He remembered his father's guilt eating him alive in the years that followed, how he'd tried and failed to track down the driver's family to help them, how the trail had gone cold after an insurance settlement got tangled in paperwork and the widow, grieving, drowning, moving twice within a year, had simply disappeared from the system. Ethan had been 22 years old and burying his own resentments toward his father at the time. Resentments about a distant, work-obsessed man who'd never been there, and he had never once let himself think about the family on the other side of that accident. The people who had lost everything so his father could come home. And now, 8 years later, dying in a bed in a penthouse built on a fortune his father had handed him, the widow of the man who saved his father's life was on her knees in front of him, cleaning up a broken glass, with no idea who she was really working for. "Elena," Ethan said, his voice shaking for the first time in longer than he could remember. "I need to tell you something. And I need you to sit down first." Guilt, when it finally surfaces after years underwater, doesn't rise gently. It explodes. Elena sat on the edge of a chair near his bed, Mia still asleep against her shoulder, watching Ethan's face drain of what little color it had left. "My father," he began, "is Robert Whitfield." For a moment the name meant nothing to her, until it did. Until the pieces clicked together with a violence that made her stomach turn. Robert Whitfield. The man Marcus had pulled from a burning car. The man whose company had sent a single condolence letter and a settlement check that barely covered the funeral, before the family's lawyers made further contact impossible. The man Elena had spent one entire winter trying to reach, leaving voicemails that were never returned, writing letters that came back unopened, until grief and the demands of a newborn daughter finally forced her to let it go. "You're his son," she said slowly, and something in her voice had gone very cold. "You're Robert Whitfield's son." "I didn't know," Ethan said, and for the first time since she'd met him, his composure had completely shattered. "I swear to you, Elena, I didn't know your name, I didn't know your face. I only knew there was a man who died and a family my father could never forgive himself for losing track of. I was 22. I was angry at him for 100 different reasons that had nothing to do with you, and I never once asked what happened to the driver's family. I never asked." His voice broke. "I've spent 8 years building an empire off decisions my father made, and I never once thought to ask what it cost the people who weren't in the room." Elena stood up so fast that Mia stirred against her shoulder, whimpering softly before settling again. "Do you have any idea," she said, her voice shaking with a fury she'd buried for years, "what those years were like? I was 6 months pregnant when they told me. I had a going-away party planned for Marcus's promotion the week after the accident. I had a name for the nursery on the wall. And then I had nothing. No husband, no income, no answers, and a company that made me feel like a burden every time I asked for help." Tears were streaming freely now. "I sent Robert Whitfield 17 letters. 17. Not one word back. I'll find out why," Ethan said desperately. "I'll find every letter, every record. It doesn't matter now," Elena said, gathering Mia tighter against her, moving toward the door. "It's 4 years too late." "Elena, wait. I need this job," she said, turning back at the doorway, her voice trembling but resolute. I need the roof it puts over my daughter's head. So I will finish my contract. I will clean your kitchen and I will do my work. But do not mistake that for forgiveness, Mr. Whitfield. You don't get to feel better about your father's guilt just because his granddaughter. She stopped herself, horrified at what she'd almost said, at the accidental truth buried in her own anger. Because that was exactly what Mia was, in every way that mattered except blood. The little girl who had wandered uninvited into a dying stranger's room and brought him a glass of water was, by the twisted architecture of fate, tied to this family by a debt that could never be repaid. Her father's life, given so this man's father could come home to him. She left the room without finishing the sentence. Ethan lay alone in the dark long after the door clicked shut, staring at the ceiling the way he had for months, except now the silence didn't feel empty. Felt like a verdict. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, at 4 a.m, weak and trembling, he had Gerald wheel him to the study, where he pulled out a box he hadn't opened since his father's stroke 2 years earlier. A box of unread correspondence, insurance files, and things Robert Whitfield had never been able to face. And there, near the bottom, wrapped in a rubber band gone brittle with age, were 17 unopened letters, each addressed in the same careful handwriting, each stamped returned to sender by an assistant who had been told years ago to make the cruise situation disappear so Robert wouldn't have to relive that night every time he checked the mail. Ethan sat alone in his study at 4 a.m, and 4-line taped to his arm, and read every single letter his father had never had the courage to open, and somewhere in the third one, surrounded by a mother's raw grief and a widow's quiet dignity, he found the name of a baby girl who hadn't been born yet. Mia Elena Cruz. The daughter of the man who had saved his father's life, sitting at the foot of his bed every night, bringing him water with 2 small, uncertain hands, completely unaware that she had wandered, by pure accident, into the middle of a debt her family had been owed for 8 long years. Some debts can't be paid with money. But that doesn't mean money can't try. For 3 days after that night, Elena kept her word. She came to work, she cleaned, she cooked, she said what needed to be said and nothing more. She stopped bringing Mia into the penthouse at all, arranging for her sister to watch her during shifts instead, even though it meant an extra hour on the subway each way and money she didn't have to spare. Ethan noticed the absence immediately. The apartment, which had started to feel almost alive in the past 2 weeks, went quiet again. Quieter somehow than before, because now he knew exactly what was missing. He didn't try to force a conversation. He'd learned, in the space of one devastating night, that forcing things was exactly the kind of behavior that had built the wall between his family and hers in the first place. Instead, he did something he hadn't done in years. He asked for help. He called his estate lawyer at 6 a.m. and had her draft something that wasn't a settlement, wasn't hush money, wasn't a PR-friendly donation with his name stamped across a building. He set up a private trust, not in his name, not tied to the company, not something that could be revoked or renegotiated by a board that had never known Marcus Cruz existed. A trust for Mia's education, fully funded, untouchable, administered by an independent party so Elena would never have to ask the Whitfield family for another cent as long as she lived. He didn't tell her about it. Not yet. Money. He understood now with a clarity his illness had somehow carved into him, was not going to fix what his father's silence had broken. Could help. It could ease a burden. But it could not undo 8 years, and he refused to let it look like he thought it could. Instead, on the 4th day, he asked Gerald to bring him a pen and paper, not a formal letter drafted by his legal team, but his own handwriting, shaking slightly from the illness, slower than it used to be. He wrote for 2 hours. He tore up 4 attempts before he got one right. And when Elena arrived for her shift that afternoon, he asked her quietly if she would read it. "I'm not asking you to forgive my father," he said, holding the folded paper out to her with a trembling hand. "I'm not even asking you to forgive me. I just need you to know that I know. All of it. What it cost you. What it should have cost my family, and didn't, because we let a lawyer make our silence look like grief." Elena didn't take the letter right away. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, arms crossed, studying him with an expression that had softened only slightly since that terrible night. "Read it to me," she said finally. "If you mean it, you can say it out loud." It was, perhaps, the hardest thing Ethan Whitfield had ever been asked to do. Harder than closing billion-dollar acquisitions, harder than facing his own mortality in a doctor's cold office. He unfolded the paper with unsteady hands and began to read. He told her about the phone call at 2 in the morning 8 years ago. About his father's voice breaking on the line. About the years of distance between him and Robert that had nothing to do with her family and everything to do with a son who resented a father for being absent. And how, in a cruel irony, that same resentment had blinded him to the fact that his father's absence in those years wasn't just about business. It was guilt. Guilt so heavy Robert Whitfield couldn't look his own son in the eye, because every time he did, he saw a life he'd been given at the cost of another man's. "He didn't tell me why he changed after the accident," Ethan read, his voice cracking. "I thought he just stopped caring about anything but work. I never knew he was drowning. And because I never asked, your letters went unanswered, and you were left to raise Mia with a debt owed to you that nobody had the courage to pay." By the end, Elena was crying. Not the furious tears of that first night, but something quieter, more exhausted, the kind of tears that come when a wound finally gets air after being sealed shut for too long. "He should have told you," she whispered. "Your father should have let you carry some of it. It wasn't fair for you to grow up thinking he just didn't love you." "No," Ethan agreed softly. "It wasn't fair to any of us." They sat in a silence that felt, for the first time, less like a standoff and more like two people slowly setting down weapons they'd both been carrying far too long. Healing rarely arrives all at once. It comes back in small, unremarkable moments, until one day you realize it's already happened. Mia came back the following week. She marched into the bedroom with the same fearless confidence she'd had the very first night, climbed onto the bench at the foot of Ethan's bed, and announced, "Butterscotch missed you," holding up her worn stuffed rabbit for inspection. "I missed him too," Ethan said, and this time when he smiled, it reached his eyes. Elena watched from the doorway, arms crossed, a small, cautious smile of her own tugging at the corner of her mouth. Something had shifted in the days since Ethan had read her that letter. Not forgiveness exactly, not yet, but the beginning of something that no longer felt like standing across a battlefield from each other. Over the following weeks, Ethan's health began, slowly, to improve. His doctors were cautiously optimistic. The rare disorder wasn't gone, but it had stabilized in a way none of them had predicted, and more than one specialist quietly noted that recovery like this was rare without a significant shift in a patient's will to live. "Whatever you're doing differently," his primary doctor told him during a checkup, glancing meaningfully at the small pink sock left behind on his blanket. "Keep doing it." What Ethan was doing differently was simple, and it had nothing to do with medicine. He was eating dinner at a table instead of alone in bed. He was asking Gerald to bring in fresh flowers because Mia liked the yellow ones best. He was learning, for the first time in his adult life, what it felt like to have someone in the house who wanted nothing from him except his attention. He and Elena talked more too. Not just about Marcus, though they returned to that conversation more than once, each time a little gentler than the last. They talked about small things. Her years teaching second grade in Ohio before everything fell apart. His childhood summers at a lake house his father sold the year after the accident, unable to bear the sight of it anymore. The unremarkable, human details neither of them had shared with anyone in years, because there had been no room for softness in either of their lives since that night on the interstate. One evening, as autumn gave way to the first cold snap of November, Ethan asked Elena to sit with him while Mia colored quietly on the floor nearby. "I want to bring my father here," he said. "To meet you both. Not to ask for anything from you. Not forgiveness, not absolution. I just think he spent 8 years being haunted by a debt he never let himself face. I think it might do something for him, to see that Marcus's daughter grew up loved and strong, in spite of everything his silence cost you." Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching Mia carefully color a picture of what appeared to be a very lopsided rabbit. "And what do you think it would do for me?" she asked finally. Ethan considered the question honestly, the way he considered so few things anymore. "I don't know," he admitted. "Maybe nothing. Maybe it would just hurt more. That's your choice, Elena, not mine. I'm not going to pretend I know what's right for you and Mia. I've done enough of my family making decisions about your family without asking." It was, Elena realized, the first time in 8 years anyone connected to the Whitfields had actually asked what she needed, instead of deciding for her. "Let me think about it," she said quietly. She thought about it for 11 days. Forgiveness is not a gift you give to someone else. It's the one you finally give yourself. Robert Whitfield arrived on a gray Sunday morning, 71 years old, walking with a cane he hadn't needed until grief had aged him faster than time ever could. He stood in the doorway of his son's penthouse, a place he had paid for and rarely visited, looking smaller and more uncertain than a man of his wealth had any right to look. Elena watched him from across the room, Mia's small hand tucked into hers, and felt something twist violently in her chest. This was the man whose name she had written 17 times on 17 envelopes that came back sealed. This was the reason her daughter had grown up without knowing what her father's laugh sounded like. "Mrs. Cruz," Robert said, his voice hoarse. He didn't come closer. He seemed, in fact, terrified to. "I don't have the words for what I owe you. I've tried for 8 years to find them and I never could, so I stopped trying, and that was its own kind of cowardice. I am so deeply sorry." "Why didn't you write back?" Elena asked, and there was no anger left in her voice, only the exhausted need to finally understand. "Just once. Just to tell me you were sorry. I would have understood if there was nothing else you could give me. I just needed to know somebody remembered what he did." Robert's composure cracked entirely. "Because every time I picked up a pen," he said, tears sliding openly down a face that had spent 8 years perfecting the art of appearing unaffected, "I saw your husband's face pulling me through that car window, and I couldn't survive knowing I was alive because a young father with a baby on the way wasn't. I told myself silence was mercy, that reminding you would only hurt you more. I understand now that it was never mercy. It was cowardice wearing mercy's clothes." The room was silent except for the soft scratch of Mia's crayon against paper, entirely unbothered by the weight of the conversation happening above her small head, until she looked up, studied the crying old man for a moment with a frank curiosity only a 3-year-old possesses, and got to her feet. She walked over to Robert Whitfield, held up her drawing, the lopsided rabbit, now colored a confident, unrealistic shade of purple, and said, "This is butterscotch. He's not scared of storms anymore because Ethan sits with him." Robert let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and knelt down, wincing at his knees, to look at the drawing properly. "He's a very handsome rabbit," he managed. "You can keep it," Mia said generously, "if you're sad." Elena watched her daughter hand a stranger, a man responsible in some tangled way for the greatest loss of her life, a piece of paper meant to comfort him, and felt the last of her anger finally loosen its grip on her chest. Not because the debt was paid, not because 8 years could be undone, but because her daughter, without any understanding of what had been lost or owed, was doing exactly what Marcus would have done, offering comfort to someone in pain simply because they were in pain, with no accounting of what they deserved. "Thank you," Robert whispered to the little girl, clutching the drawing like it was made of glass. "Thank you." Elena wiped her eyes and looked at Ethan, who was watching from his wheelchair near the window, his own eyes wet. "He would have liked you," she said quietly to Robert. "Marcus. He always said the measure of a man wasn't what he had, but what he did when nobody was watching to see if he'd do the right thing. I have spent 8 years failing that measure," Robert said. "Then spend the rest of your years passing it," Elena replied. "That's all any of us can do. The most dangerous moment of any recovery is the one nobody prepares you for. The moment you believe you're finally safe. Winter settled over the city, and with it came a fragile new rhythm to the Whitfield penthouse. Ethan's health continued its slow, steady climb. He was walking short distances now, off the feeding line entirely, color returning to a face that had been gray for months. Robert visited every Sunday, bringing small gifts for Mia that grew more thoughtful each week, watching his son laugh, for the first time since before his own wife had died when Ethan was a teenager. Elena had, cautiously, let herself believe things might finally be settling into something good. She had accepted the trust fund for Mia's education, not because it erased anything, but because Ethan had made clear over and over that it wasn't meant to. It was simply meant to make sure her daughter never had to grow up the way she had, one emergency away from losing everything. Then, on a Thursday in late January, everything nearly fell apart. Ethan collapsed during a routine physical therapy session, his heart rate spiking dangerously before crashing. He was rushed to the hospital, and for 6 hours, the disorder that had seemed to be retreating roared back with terrifying force. Doctors spoke to Elena and Robert in hushed, careful tones about complications, about the unpredictable nature of his condition, about preparing for the possibility that the improvement of the past months had only ever been temporary. Elena sat in that hospital waiting room until 3 a.m, Mia asleep across 2 plastic chairs beside her, and found herself praying with a desperation she hadn't felt since the night the police had knocked on her door 4 years earlier. "Please," she whispered to whoever might be listening. "Not again. Don't take another one." Robert sat across from her, his cane between his knees, his face a mask of exhausted terror. "I can't lose him," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. "Not after finally getting him back." "You won't," Elena said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. She reached over and took the old man's trembling hand. "He's stronger than he was 3 months ago. Not just his body. That matters more than the doctors know how to measure." At 5 a.m, a doctor finally emerged with news that Ethan had stabilized, that whatever had triggered the crisis had passed, that his numbers were climbing back toward normal, that he would need weeks of careful monitoring but that, for now, he was going to be all right. Elena didn't remember deciding to cry. She simply found herself sobbing into Robert Whitfield's shoulder, a man who 8 months ago she couldn't have imagined forgiving, and who now felt, impossibly, like family. When they were finally allowed into his room, Ethan was pale and hooked to more machines than before, but awake. His eyes found Elena's immediately. "Where's Mia?" he asked, voice raspy. "Asleep in the hallway." "She wouldn't leave," Elena said, laughing wetly. "She kept telling the nurses you needed butterscotch." Ethan managed a weak smile. "Bring him in." Elena went to retrieve her sleepy daughter, who blinked awake, immediately alert the moment she understood where she was. She toddled into the hospital room clutching her worn rabbit, climbed carefully onto the edge of Ethan's bed despite a nurse's protest, and tucked butterscotch beneath his arm. "He'll keep the scary dreams away," she told him solemnly. "That's his job." "Thank you," Ethan whispered, closing his eyes, exhausted but smiling. "I think I needed him tonight. Family isn't always the one you're born into. Sometimes it's the one that walks into your life uninvited, refuses to leave, and rebuilds you from the inside out." Ethan's recovery this time was slower and more careful. The scare in January had shaken everyone, doctors, Robert, Elena, into treating his health with a seriousness that no amount of money had ever bought before. But by March, he was strong enough to leave the penthouse for the first time in nearly a year, and the first place he asked to go wasn't a board meeting or a hospital follow-up. It was a small cemetery outside Columbus, Ohio. Elena hadn't expected the request. She stood beside him on a cool spring afternoon, Mia's hand in hers, in front of a modest granite headstone that read Marcus Anthony Cruz, beloved husband and father, along with dates that marked a life cut painfully short. Ethan, still weak, still leaning slightly on a cane of his own now, knelt down carefully in front of the grave. He set down a single object. Not flowers, not a note, but a small model of the exact building his father's company had been headquartered in 8 years earlier, the building Robert Whitfield had been driving home from the night of the accident. "I never got to thank you," Ethan said quietly, to a man he had never met, a man whose sacrifice had shaped his life in ways he was only now beginning to understand. "You saved my father's life. And somehow, 8 years later, your daughter saved mine. I don't know if that's fate or coincidence, or just the universe finding a way to balance the scales. But I promise you, she will never want for anything as long as I'm alive to make sure of it. Neither will your wife. That's not charity. That's a debt, and I intend to spend the rest of my life paying it." Mia, standing beside the grave with a particular solemnity children reserve for moments they don't fully understand but sense are important, tugged on Ethan's sleeve. "Is this my daddy?" she asked. Elena knelt down beside her daughter, throat tight. "Yes, baby. This is your daddy. He was the bravest man I ever knew." "Like Ethan?" Mia asked innocently, looking between the headstone and the man kneeling beside it. Elena and Ethan exchanged a look neither of them could quite put into words, something that had grown slowly, quietly, over the past 6 months, in the space between grief and gratitude, in the long evenings of shared dinners and small kindnesses that neither of them had been in a position to name yet. "Something like that," Elena said softly. They stayed at the grave until the sun began to set, and for the first time since Marcus's death, Elena felt something other than loss standing over that headstone. She felt, impossibly, like her husband's sacrifice had finally, fully, found its meaning. Not erased, never that, but honored in a way she never could have imagined 4 years earlier, crying alone in a hospital hallway with a police officer's hand on her shoulder. On the drive back to New York, Mia fell asleep in her car seat, butterscotch tucked under her chin. Ethan reached over carefully and took Elena's hand. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to know I'm here. Whatever this becomes, friendship, family, nothing more than what it already is, I'm not going anywhere." Elena looked down at their joined hands, then out the window at the fading Ohio countryside, and let herself, for the first time in 4 years, imagine a future that didn't feel like something to simply survive. "I know," she said softly. "I know you're not. Every family at some point is built from wreckage. What matters isn't the wreckage. What matters is who chooses to stay and rebuild." A year passed. Ethan Whitfield's disorder, while never fully gone, had stabilized into something manageable, a condition he lived with rather than one that was slowly ending him. He returned to his company, but differently than before. The boardroom no longer consumed every hour of his life, and for the first time, he left the office by 6 most evenings, because there was a small girl waiting who insisted on his presence at bath time to supervise Butterscotch's nightly swim. Elena no longer worked as a housekeeper. At Robert's quiet insistence, and with her own hard-earned teaching credentials finally put to use again, she now ran a small non-profit the Whitfield family had funded, one that supported families who had lost a parent in workplace or commuting accidents, cutting through exactly the kind of bureaucratic silence that had once nearly swallowed her own grief whole. She had turned her worst year into something that now helped hundreds of families avoid the isolation she'd once endured. Robert Whitfield, 72 now, had become something he'd never expected to be again in his old age. A grandfather in every way that mattered, showing up every Sunday without fail, teaching Mia, now 4, sharper and funnier by the day, how to skip stones at the lake house he had, after 8 years, finally bought back. And Ethan and Elena, slowly, carefully, without ever needing a single dramatic declaration, had become a family. Not overnight. Not because tragedy demanded a neat resolution, but because 2 broken people, connected by a debt neither of them had asked for, had chosen, day after day, small kindness after small kindness, to become something whole together. On a warm evening in late spring, Exactly 1 year after Mia had first wandered uninvited into a dying stranger's bedroom carrying a cup of water in two small, uncertain hands, the three of them sat together on the balcony of the penthouse, the same city lights glittering below that Ethan had once stared at alone in the dark, convinced there was nothing left in the world worth staying alive for. "Tell me the story again," Mia said, climbing into Ethan's lap with the easy familiarity of a child who had long since stopped seeing him as anything other than hers. "The one about the water. You know this one by heart," Ethan said, smiling. "Tell it anyway." So he did. He told her about a night he thought would be his last, about a little girl who walked into his room uninvited and sat down like she owned the place, about a glass of water that turned out to be the first real kindness he'd been offered in years. He told her gently about her father, a man he never met, whose courage had rippled forward 8 years to save a stranger's son, and whose daughter had, without ever knowing it, saved that same man twice over. "You were very brave," Mia told him seriously, patting his hand the way she had that very first night. "Like my daddy." "I had a very good teacher," Ethan said, glancing at Elena, who was watching them both with an expression that held 4 years of grief and 1 year of unexpected healing, all at once. "If there's one thing this story teaches us, it's this. Kindness doesn't ask if you deserve it. It doesn't wait for the perfect moment, or the right explanation, or permission from the adults who think they know better. Sometimes it just walks in, sits down at the foot of your bed, and refuses to leave. And in doing so, it saves you long before you even understand what you were being saved from." If this story touched your heart tonight, please hit that like button. It truly helps this channel keep telling stories like Ethan, Elena, and Mia's. Subscribe if you're new here because we bring you a new story just like this one every single week. And if you know someone who needs a reminder that healing is possible, that family can be found in the most unexpected places, please share this with them tonight. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next story. Yellow Heart.